Welcome to the Sales Readiness Podcast brought to you by SRG, a part of SBI. Each episode features an unfiltered conversation between our host, SBI's Managing Director Ray Makela, and an industry expert about the strategies, skills, and solutions that drive sales performance to the next level. These conversations are packed with expert advice, real-world examples, and practical tips to help you close deals, lead teams, and outperform the competition. In this episode, Ray is joined by Chasta Bair, a Senior Delivery Consultant at SRG, a part of SBI, to explore what truly motivates sellers and how managers can create an environment of growth and engagement. By leveraging the motive model to understand individual motivators and generational differences, sales leaders can keep their team inspired and performing at their best.
Hey, Chasta, welcome. Excited to chat with you today. Welcome to the podcast, and we're going to talk motivation. So I think it's a great topic to kick off the new year, but just in terms of that, because it is the time people are setting their expectations, their quotas, targets for the year, the idea of how do we actually help our teams get there and stay motivated throughout the year is one that I think is on the top of people's minds. And I know it's a topic we've talked about extensively in the past. Maybe we could start, have you share a little bit about your background and how you come to this topic as a seller, a trainer, your perspective, then we'll dive into some specific questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ray. I really appreciate you having me here. This is such a timely topic, right? We're at the turn of the new year. This is the question that I am getting from sales leaders at every organization that I work with. And I think about my time as a sales leader, especially that first decade as a sales manager. This was a constant question. And we think about, we're at the end of the year, at the beginning of the year, right? From fiscal years. And we're in like reflection and planning session. So sales leaders are doing some reflection and thinking about how can they elevate, sustain motivation, right? And it sort of dovetails into the topic of retention. We think about motivation as a leading indicator of talent. This was not anything that I was considering when I was a sales manager. That's for sure. So it's important for us to be having these conversations. And, you're going to hear me probably share multiple times normalizing having conversations, right, about motivation, because it's on everyone's mind, whether you're a seller, you're a sales manager, you're a GTM leader. This is top of mind for everybody.
No, I think it is really critical. And to your point, it's I don't know if an afterthought, but I know early in my career, I didn't really anticipate that people would be so motivated by different things than I was. It's kind of like, oh, well, this is what motivates me. Why isn't that working? And we'll get into that a little bit further as we go along. But maybe we could start and just talk about, what are some of the important factors that drive motivation? I mean, why are we talking about this? And what are some of the things we can do to drive motivation with our team?
When we think about motivation, oftentimes we're thinking about it in terms of what do we want people to do? And I encourage sales leaders in all of our engagements to sort of take a step back. When I think about motivation, what is promoting motivation, what's detracting from motivation, I think about what is the team atmosphere? What is the environment that leader has either created intentionally or left to unintentionally create itself, right? And so often we think about how do we get them to do more? Motivation becomes like a more type of atmosphere. But when we think about a factor that's driving a team motivation, what's the team atmosphere, right? And as leaders, the onus is on us to take a step back, reflect on that, right? What have we contributed? Where do we need to lean in? Has that team culture and motivation just created itself? Or have we intentionally cultivated a motivating, high-performing atmosphere?
Well, and I love that. Even just calling it out and saying, well, this is something we should think about, and maybe doing a little bit of our own diagnostic, right? Or temperature check on, where's the team? I know in our training, we talk about this motive model, which is something that I've found really valuable over time. Can you talk about a few of those elements? I mean, how does that come into play when we're talking to individuals about their motivation?
Yeah. when we show the motive model, right, in our sales training, our leadership training, it's money, opportunity, teamwork, independence, visibility, and excellence, right? And some of those sort of ring true naturally for us as sellers, but what always bubbles up to the surface in these conversations are, I did not consider as a sales manager how one or two of these motivations are typically the primary
Hmm.
motivators for sellers, and that it changes both in intensity, right? And also in the way that they approach their business. And I like to think of it seasonally,
Hmm.
right? One of the most challenging things one of the most challenging questions, I should say, that we ask as leaders, right? Especially this time of year. So, what are your goals for this year, right? Outside of a quota. But what we don't do is we don't give them something to react to. The motive model, right? All of those elements, it generates some very natural and organic conversation amongst sales leaders. When we give our sellers something like the motive model to react to, right, as a prompt, it helps guide the conversation. And I think that that is key. It's if I asked you on the spot, Ray, right now for 2025, what do you want for your year? Right? You'd probably be a little bit taken aback. It might take you a few minutes to answer. It's not something that we naturally can just rattle off. So I think the way that we approach these types of conversations really matters from a leadership perspective. Because if we're going to lean in, the hope is that those sellers lean into us as well.
Well, and I think that's a great segue to talk about some of those individual factors, because even just having a framework to have the conversation is really helpful. And as you mentioned, motive, those different components. I mean, it starts with money, but as we know, money is maybe necessary, but not sufficient. And it's
Mhm.
not the key motivator. Some people are more motivated, but there are other factors that may actually be much more important to them. And as you said, depending on where they are in their career, in kind of their own personal development, I think those are critical. How do you know what somebody's motivated by? I mean, how do you get, if you have those 5 or 6 items, how do you know what's most important?
Yeah. I think as sales leaders, we are often observers of behavior, right? And so, what types of things are your sellers typically leaning into? What are they talking about? What gets them excited, right? They leave clues, I would say. But the best way, and I think the freshest approach from a sales leader to a seller is just ask them, right? Normalize having the conversation around all of those factors of motivation. It's okay to just say, what gets you excited? What is most important to you in this season? Outside of just hitting your target this quarter, right? What types of environmental things will set you up for success and keep you engaged? Because when we think about motivation, the two words that come to mind for me are engagement and influence, right? What are you doing as a sales leader to engage your team, engage them in a language that they understand, right? That resonates with them. And maybe even before that, what level of influence do you have with your team and with the individuals on your team? And then I would say, how do you know?
Right.
Right? How do you know?
And it is interesting in workshops to have the discussions with managers. It's like, well, have you asked them? Have you talked to them? It's like, well, no, I was just supposed to guess, or I just thought I knew. And it's
Mhm.
interesting when you do have that conversation, you find out that maybe there are hidden motivators that haven't become apparent. But some of these are almost in conflict when we think about, teamwork and visibility. So the T and the V
Yeah.
versus, independence and excellence. And we all know those people, right? Leave me alone. I want to do a good job. Don't
Yeah.
recognize me. That makes me uncomfortable. Versus, no, I want to be there leading the team and leading the event. So we really need to think about, where do these people fall, and then start to speak their language, right? Start to meet them where they are when
Yeah.
we're trying to address that motivation.
Well, and how do we sort of litmus test that? And that goes back to, giving them something like this motive framework to react to. Like these few aren't super important to me right now. These ones really are. So if I said to you, Ray, teamwork is very important to me, and you said, okay, great, teamwork's important to me too. We could mean very different things, right? When we think about the ones we typically associate with sales, right? Money, opportunity, independence, maybe even visibility.
Mhm, mhm.
Two that stand out to me are teamwork and excellence that are often undervalued and overlooked, right? Undervalued and overlooked. And so we make a lot of assumptions as to what motivates people, or we sort of paint in broad strokes, if you will. Well, if they're in sales, they must be motivated by money. Maybe not, right? Or they've been in sales for a while and they've established a certain, level of income, standard of living, right? That there's not been much variation to. Their motivations could change, right? Based on that. So it's an interesting dynamic for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about how to implement, like, what is the action plan, which is, I think, the other part of that then is once you identify, all right, how are we going to put that in place or support that? And some of that comes up in many cases, we're managing or leading people across different generations, right? That they kind of have different motivators, if you will, or at least appear that way. I know it could be a whole separate podcast topic, but I'd love to get your take on that. I know we both have adult children. So, how does that change? How do you meet them? And I have some personal thoughts on, how they're different or not, but I'd love to get your take. I mean, does that come into play? Do you think about that?
It does. When we think about generational buckets, if you will, or what we're really talking about are prevailing value systems,
Hmm.
right? Within certain groups. And it's interesting because, I think about how much we identify or don't identify with our particular, generational bucket. I feel just about the least millennial of the millennials, right? I'm an older millennial anyway, but I don't necessarily identify with those qualities. Why? Right? Well, a lot of that has to do with your life experience and the stage of life that you're in. So, the first thing that I would say generationally is to litmus test your assumptions, right? We've already talked about this. I think probably the worst thing that we can do in terms of motivation generationally, individually on a team is to operate based on our assumptions. Have you ever read that book, The Five Love Languages?
Yep.
Right? Where it's like you think you are speaking someone's motivational language and it is not at all resonating with them. Right? It's a foreign concept. So it absolutely comes up. It absolutely comes up I call it seasonally, right? Like, are you early in career? Are you managing a team of very early in career folks, right, that are building the career? Are you managing a team of folks that are in a different season, in a later season, of life? Or is it a mixed bag? Um, Something that tends to come up in all of my conversation with sales leaders, though, is a missed opportunity in fostering collaborative and collective conversations cross generationally with teams, right? When I think about the influence that, take a baby boomer, right, can have on someone my age, or the generations that come after that, there's so much value in that shared experience and the shared, I would say, normalization of where they are in their career, what's motivating them, and sharing stories about removing barriers to that.
Well, that's great. Now I love getting them talking and across generation because, and I appreciate you saying that I think their generations are more similar than they are different. And also
Yeah.
the variations within are so dramatic that I think it's risky to generalize. And sometimes I get really frustrated when people are stereotyping a particular group. It's like,
Yeah.
well, that's not my experience, actually.
Yeah.
Um, but when we think about some of those things, like, well, do they value more stability, right? And giving back, or having that sense of contribution? Is it more about opportunity because they're growing and they want to really expand, or maybe doing social good and they want to have a purpose? Like those are all important things to have conversations about. I think it is risky to try to pigeonhole people and say, okay, well, this is how we're going to treat them one way or another. I think the best way is to have that conversation and engage in the dialogue.
I had a conversation with a sales leader this week, and we were having a similar conversation as they were planning for their next fiscal. And he said, I realized this week that I know my clients better than I know my team of sellers. Meaning, what's going on in their life? Do they have new babies? Are they in a caregiving season where they're caring for aging parents? Right? Is there an illness in the family? Is there, a milestone? Are they buying a home? Are they, those sorts of things? He said, I don't know that I could say that about every member of my team. So, this whole idea of getting vulnerable, normalizing conversations around what's the season that you're in, what do you need, what is keeping you engaged, right? Sometimes motivation can be a dirty word, so I encourage sales leaders to use the word engagement or influence, right? More often than not, engagement feels like a very empowered word for a seller. This I'm engaged most when. And it's
Hmm.
interesting because most of the time, from a sales leader perspective, we're not holding a mirror up enough to gauge, what am I doing to drive engagement? What am I doing that disengages my sellers, right? Demotivates my sellers. And do I know which levers, right, to pull or not pull with the members of my team?
Well, and that actually brings up a really important point about, as much as we think about what motivates them, understanding what demotivates them, and that can have a multiplier effect
For
both on their
sure.
attitude and the team. And if we get that wrong, I think it can have dramatic impacts. And as you were talking about, that the whole point of the conversation is, if we can get better engagement and get them to lean in a little bit more, it improves performance, it improves retention, it improves their job satisfaction. I mean, it has a multiplier. By the same token, if we mess it up or don't understand what those factors are, I think it can be really detrimental. Just in the few minutes we have, let's talk a little bit about, are there some fun things you've run into and used in your past to motivate your team? I mean, we're thinking about things like the teamwork, healthy competition, making it fun. What are some of the things that you've seen work successfully?
Yeah. I think about my selling days, and the go-to fun, creative thing was always around a spiff, right? It was like, make it a competition, win this amount of money. I think that works sometimes, but we have to get a bit more creative with our sellers, right? Based on the makeup of the team. That's the other piece of it is,
Hmm.
if we are focused on creating engagement and motivating the team, it's really about unity and drawing them together. So, can you get creative in how you run your team meetings? Can you ask them for feedback and ideas, or dub different co hosts, right, for team meetings and different themes? How can you draw them back together? And I would also encourage shuffling the deck, right? When we think about our teams, there's folks that naturally gravitate towards one another. And I think that that's great. But how can we creatively draw people together that bring out the best? It kind of goes back to what you were saying about, generational. There's also the personality types
Mhm.
that play into that. So I think first and foremost is know your team, observe what's worked in the past, right? If you've been together for a sales kickoff, as an example, in the past, what breakouts did they go to? What were they most excited about? Think about what has worked successfully in the past and look for ways to replicate it. I think that the key here is, don't wait and just hope that engagement and motivation is going to improve, right? Hope is not a strategy. So, first and foremost, just resolve to know your people at a deeper level. And then, as long as you are approaching them with intention and good spirit, right, and doing your best to keep the engagement high, I think the sky's the limit on what you can do from a creative perspective.
Well, and it's outstanding because I think it really does follow the conversation of, yeah, let's have clear expectations. Let's have our goals. Let's lay out the plan for the year. But also, let's remember these are humans and we need to keep them motivated and engaged throughout the year. And it's on us as sales leaders to create that environment and to make that work. And if we can do that, I think the multiplier effect is really profound. And we want to help do that to improve the performance, right? Overall.
Absolutely.
All right.
People perform their best and at their highest level when they feel like they are a part of something, right? That's a fact across industries, across roles, but particularly with sellers. Selling can be a lonely venture at times. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be.
That's great. They want to win for sure. So just to wrap up, what would you leave the leaders with in terms of a takeaway, a suggestion, just something you would want to share on motivating their team for 2025?
Yeah. Having conversations about motivation can be vulnerable, right? So as a leader, your job is to go first. Be vulnerable first. In order for you to know your people at a deeper level, you have to have a willingness to have those conversations, take a step forward, and create a motivation strategy together.
I love that. And I think that's a great place to wrap up for today. So thank you very much for the conversation. Really enjoyed it. Lots more to talk about on this topic, but we'll leave it there for today. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray.
You've been listening to SBI's Sales Readiness Podcast with Managing Director Ray Makela hosting. Visit sbigrowth.com to read SBI's latest research, join upcoming events, or learn about SBI's talent and training services. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and connect with us on LinkedIn.